The bustling airport terminal was alive with movement, conversations blending into a chorus of hurried voices. In the middle of the first-class check-in line stood a man, dressed in a modest plaid shirt, a worn-out cap pulled low over his eyes. He carried an old leather bag slung over one shoulder, his sneakers scuffed from years of travel. There was nothing particularly flashy about him, yet he held an air of quiet confidence. That man was Tom Hanks. Before continuing our story, if you subscribe and like the video, you will provide us with the greatest support. Keep in mind that a new video will come every day. Just a few feet behind him, standing rigid with impatience, was Richard Coleman, a corporate executive used to the finer things in life. He wore a tailored navy blue suit that fit him like a second skin, his polished shoes gleaming under the bright airport lights. His designer suitcase rested beside him, a clear symbol of his wealth and success. Richard had not always been this way. He had grown up in a struggling household, watching his father work long hours in a factory while his mother took on sewing jobs at home. He had sworn to himself that he would never live like that he would earn his way into a life of luxury and never look back. Over the years, he had built a career that reflected his ambition. Wealth, power, and influence had become his identity. But something still felt missing. As Richard tapped his foot against the tiled floor, his eyes landed on Tom. His brow furrowed slightly. The man in front of him, dressed so casually, seemed entirely out of place in the first-class line. Richard scoffed under his breath. "Guess they're letting anyone fly first class these days," he muttered, just loud enough for Tom to hear. Tom, without turning around, let out a small chuckle. "Airplanes are great equalizers, aren't they?" he replied calmly. Richard smirked. "Yeah, I suppose, but some of us actually belong up here. Others, well, let's just say they usually end up in coach." The line moved forward, and the two men handed over their tickets. Moments later, they found themselves walking down the jet bridge and stepping onto the luxurious first-class cabin of the plane. Richard made his way to his seat, only to pause mid-step when he realized something rather unsettling. Tom Hanks was settling into the seat right beside his. Richard let out a soft groan. "Oh, come on," he mumbled under his breath as he reluctantly sat down. He turned to Tom. "Looks like we're travel buddies." Tom flashed a friendly smile. "Sure does." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Richard decided to strike up a conversation, more out of boredom than genuine interest. "So, what do you do?" he asked with a practiced curiosity, already assuming the man in plaid had some mundane job. Tom glanced at him with a knowing glint in his eye. "I work in film." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Oh, independent stuff?" "Small projects?" Tom shrugged. "Something like that." Richard chuckled. "See, that's the problem these days. Everyone's chasing a dream, thinking they can just walk into first class without actually earning it. But real success, that takes years of grinding, of knowing the right people." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That's one way to see it. But sometimes success isn't just about what you earn. It's about what you give." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "That's a nice sentiment. But in the real world, money talks. If you don't have it, you don't belong in places like this." The flight attendant arrived, offering drinks. Richard requested an expensive scotch, making sure to emphasize the brand, while Tom simply asked for water. Richard chuckled. "Water? In first class? Man, you really are missing out." Tom smiled. Sometimes, simple things are enough. The conversation continued in a similar pattern. Richard subtly throwing jabs, trying to establish his dominance, while Tom remained effortlessly composed, answering with a wisdom that seemed to disarm the businessman at every turn. A few hours into the flight, turbulence shook the cabin. The lights flickered briefly, and a nervous murmur ran through the passengers. Richard gripped the armrest, his face slightly pale. "Not a fan of turbulence?" Tom asked gently. Richard let out a dry laugh. "I just like being in control, that's all. Planes don't exactly allow for that." Tom nodded. "Life doesn't either. You learn to ride the bumps." The plane steadied, but something in Richard's demeanor had changed. He turned toward Tom, curiosity finally outweighing his arrogance. "You really believe all that? About success, giving, all of it?" Tom leaned back, studying him. "I do. I've seen a lot in my life. The people who are happiest aren't the ones with the most, but the ones who do the most for others." Richard frowned. "Easy for you to say. You're in first class too, aren't you?" Tom chuckled. "I've been in coach plenty of times. I've met people from all walks of life. It's the connections, not the money, that stay with you." Just then, a commotion started at the front of the cabin. A young woman, a few rows ahead, clutched her chest, gasping for breath. Panic rippled through the passengers. The flight attendants rushed forward. Tom immediately unbuckled his seatbelt. "I know CPR," he said, moving toward her. Richard watched as Tom calmly assisted, giving clear instructions to the crew. His hands were steady, his presence unwavering. Within minutes, the woman's breathing stabilized, and a round of relieved applause filled the cabin. Richard swallowed hard. His entire perspective was shifting. This man, whom he had mocked, had just saved a life without hesitation. As the plane descended toward its destination, Richard sat in deep thought, reflecting on his life, his choices, and what truly mattered. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, he was ready to change. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Richard felt an unusual weight in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was from turbulence or the conversation he had with Tom Hanks. He had spent the entire flight trying to assert his superiority, only to realize he had been sitting next to a man whose presence alone commanded respect, not because of wealth or power, but because of his character. Richard unbuckled his seatbelt, glancing at Tom, who remained calm as ever. The applause from earlier, when he had saved the young woman, had died down, but the admiration in the eyes of the passengers still lingered. "First time seeing CPR in action?" Tom asked with a slight smile. Richard cleared his throat. "Not exactly, but first time seeing it done without hesitation." Tom shrugged, standing up as the cabin doors opened. "It's just about being in the right place at the right time." Richard hesitated. "You didn't have to do that, you know. Most people wouldn't." Tom nodded. "That's the thing. Most people could. They just don't." As they stepped into the airport terminal, Richard's mind raced. He had always believed that wealth defined worth, that sitting in first class meant you had won in life. But Tom had just shattered that illusion. They walked side by side toward baggage claim. Richard found himself slowing down, prolonging the moment, not wanting the conversation to end. "Listen," Richard finally said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Back on the plane, I was a real ass." Tom chuckled. "I've heard worse." Richard exhaled. "No, really. I've spent so much time proving to everyone that I'm successful, I forgot to ask myself if I actually am." Tom studied him for a moment before speaking. "Success isn't a title, Richard. It's the impact you leave on others." Richard felt those words sink deep. He had built a career on being seen, but had he ever done anything worth remembering? Had anyone ever looked at him the way those passengers had looked at Tom today? Tom reached for his bag from the carousel, You know, it's never too late to change. Richard swallowed. How do you even start? Tom smiled. By asking the right questions. And with that, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard stood there for a long time, watching the man who had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about life. Something inside him stirred. He wasn't sure what it was, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was waking up. Richard stood motionless in the bustling airport, gripping the handle of his designer suitcase. He watched Tom disappear into the crowd, his words still echoing in his mind. Success isn't a title. It's the impact you leave on others. For years, Richard had measured his life by the size of his bank account, the brands he wore, and the exclusivity of the places he could access. But what had any of it really meant? Had he ever done anything truly valuable? Anything that mattered? With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone. His assistant had left several messages reminding him of his upcoming meetings in New York, but instead of replying, his fingers hovered over another contact. Dad. He hadn't spoken to his father in nearly 6 months. Their last conversation had ended in an argument. Richard had criticized him for still living in the same modest house, for not aspiring for more. His father had simply sighed and said, "Not everything is about more, son." For the first time, Richard understood what he had meant. He pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before a familiar weathered voice answered. "Richard?" "Hey, Dad." Richard cleared his throat. I just landed. I was thinking maybe I'd come visit." A brief pause, then a warm chuckle. "Well, that'd be a first. Everything okay?" Richard exhaled. "Yeah, I think I just need to talk." His father's voice softened. "Door's always open, son." Richard ended the call and booked a last-minute ticket home. For once, he wasn't rushing to a business deal or an exclusive event. He was going somewhere that actually mattered. The old neighborhood looked exactly the same. The small single-story house he had grown up in still had the creaky wooden fence, the front porch with the chipped paint, and the same old oak tree where he used to sit with his mother on summer evenings. Richard stepped out of the taxi, hesitating before knocking on the door. His father answered almost immediately. He had aged, the wrinkles on his face deeper, but his eyes were the same, kind and knowing. "Well, would you look at that?" his father said with a smirk. The big-shot businessman finally found his way back. Richard let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, guess so." His father stepped aside. "Come on in." The inside of the house smelled the same. Coffee, old books, and a hint of motor oil from his dad's workbench in the garage. The walls were covered in old family photos, most of them fading. Richard glanced at a particular photo, one of him as a young boy, sitting on his father's shoulders, laughing. "When did we stop talking?" Richard asked suddenly. His father sighed, settling into his chair. "I think when you decided you were too good for this place." Richard flinched. It was true. He had spent so long trying to distance himself from his humble beginnings that he had pushed away the very people who had loved him most. "I met someone on a flight today," Richard admitted. "He made me realize I've been living life all wrong." His father raised an eyebrow. "Must have been some conversation." Richard nodded. "He asked me what I'd be remembered for, and I didn't have an answer." His father leaned back. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Richard stared at the floor. "I don't know, but I want to start somewhere." His father smiled. "That's a good first step." Over the next few weeks, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He slowed down. He spent more time with his father, helping him fix things around the house. Listening to stories he had once brushed off as irrelevant. He reconnected with his sister, whom he had barely spoken to since she had chosen a career in teaching, rather than chasing wealth like he had. He even reached out to an old friend from college, one he had lost touch with after deciding their ambitions didn't align. To his surprise, the friend welcomed him back without hesitation. One evening, while scrolling through his emails, Richard noticed a charity initiative looking for corporate sponsors. Normally, he would have ignored it, but this time, he clicked on it. A week later, he found himself at a small community center, meeting with volunteers, listening to their stories, and for the first time in his life, he wrote a check not for tax benefits or publicity, but because he genuinely wanted to help. As he handed the check over, one of the volunteers, an elderly woman, squeezed his hand. "You're making a real difference," she said. For the first time, Richard felt it. Not a business deal, not a promotion, not a material gain, just purpose. Months later, Richard found himself back in an airport terminal, but this time, he wasn't impatient. He wasn't rolling his eyes at people or measuring his worth by the ticket in his hand. He had changed. As he walked toward his gate, he spotted a familiar face sitting near a cafe, Tom Hanks. Richard hesitated, then took a deep breath and walked over. Tom looked up, then smiled. "Richard, you remember me?" Richard asked, surprised. Tom chuckled. "Hard to forget someone who spent an entire flight debating success with me." Richard laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, about that. You were right." Tom's eyes twinkled. "About what?" Richard sat down across from him. "Success. It's not about what you have. It's about what you leave behind, the impact you make." Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Looks like you figured it out." Richard smiled. "Still working on it, but I'm getting there." Tom raised his coffee cup. "That's all that matters." As Richard sat there, chatting with the man who had unknowingly changed his life, he realized something. He was finally at peace. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted to be remembered for. Success is not measured by money, titles, or status. It's measured by the impact we have on others, the kindness we show, the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind. So ask yourself, what will you be remembered for? If you liked the video and want new videos to come, you can like the video and follow us by subscribing. Have a nice day.